In a lot of ways, you've probably heard the kind of phrase that, the eyes are the window to the soul. I would argue that
hmm
meetings are the window to an organization.
Every meeting, every decision, and every interaction at work is driven by an invisible force, which is your workplace culture. And if you feel like we've been talking about culture for a long time, I agree, but our guest today says it's something we just have to keep working on because it's really the fuel that drives organizational performance.
I don't know that we'll ever stop talking about culture at work because, for as long as there's been work and as long as there have been people and as long as there will be work and people, we'll be talking about how do those things fit together and how do we kind of organize ourselves so that we get those things done in really productive and effective ways.
Welcome to Work Better, the Steelcase podcast where we think about work and ways to make it better. I'm your host, Chris Congdon, and my guest today is workplace culture expert and consultant, Khalil Smith. And Khalil is also the author of a new book called The Performance Culture. And he says that one of the newer challenges that organizations face when it comes to their culture is really this tension between a very vocal employee base that wants organizations to take action on social and political issues, and then financial stakeholders who really want the focus to be on revenue generation and growth. Here's my conversation with Khalil. Welcome to Work Better, Khalil.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm super excited. A little bit scared from some of the other folks that I've seen that you have on, but I'm excited for the conversation.
No way. We have such a friendly group of people who join us who we're all passionate about our work and, what we're learning. And I'm really interested in talking more with you. First of all, because you have a fairly new book that's come out, which is exciting. I have so much admiration for people and all the labor it takes to get a book out into the world. And it's called The Performance Culture. So I want to ask maybe a tough question right from the start, but it feels like we've been talking about culture in the world of work for a long time. And I'm curious what you felt was what's changed? Like what's going on out there in the world that it feels like we have something else we've got to talk about when it comes to culture at work?
Yeah, in part, I think a lot has changed, and in part, I think not a lot has changed. And so I don't know that we'll ever stop talking about culture at work because, for as long as there's been work and as long as there have been people and as long as there will be work and people, we'll be talking about how do those things fit together and how do we kind of organize ourselves so that we get those things done in really productive and effective ways. For me, it's kind of goes back to there's a quote, all models are wrong, some models are useful. And so I wanted to put something into the kind of business and leadership world that was useful for folks. I, benefited so much early in my career from reading the Jim Collins and Simon Sinek's and, Malcolm Gladwell's and others. And the opportunity to add to that after, decades in leadership and kind of studying and seeing what works was an amazing opportunity that I just couldn't pass up.
Yeah. Well, so I want to dig a little bit deeper into, I think, a cultural conversation that we've been having or haven't been having. And when we speak of some of the other guests we've had on the show, I got a chance to talk with Nick Epley at U of Chicago, who was encouraging us to have conversations that we know are going to be kind of difficult. And it feels like in the realm of culture, for a lot of years, we've talked about the importance of things like diversity in cultures, right. Whether it's diversity of thought or diversity of experiences, backgrounds, racial diversity. Yeah. The same thing with the notion of inclusion. Like inclusion has been a topic that we've talked a lot about sometimes, about how important it is that everybody feels included and feels like they're having equitable experiences. It feels like that's getting a hard conversation to have when it comes to culture. And I'm wondering what you have found about that in your work.
Yeah, for sure. And Chris, to your point, some of the language around, if we think of the kind of, DEI, there's been
Right.
a lot right now. And so hopefully folks are listening to this now and in the future. And in the future, they're saying, well, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
What's the challenge? Of course, we want to surround ourselves with people that think differently and look different and bring different perspectives and backgrounds.
Yeah.
I think that in so many instances, what you were describing of we've tried to bring so many people along and we've talked about inclusion for all, that message hasn't gotten through to everyone. And so in some instances, the work that folks have done has felt more exclusive, or it's felt more like it's only about a particular demographic, or, correcting kind of some institutional challenges and barriers. And while that may absolutely be a part of it, there is an element of kind of this classic of rising tide raises all boats. And so, if we think about some of the challenges that folks have, whether that's around ageism or biases against smokers or people who may be a bit heavier or any of the various things that go on, we've traditionally defined diversity as very narrow. And so if we're talking about men and women, sometimes men have felt left out. If we're talking about race, sometimes certain, ethnic groups have felt left out.
Yeah.
When in reality, I think when we do this work really well, we're talking about all of us. And we're talking about how do we remove those barriers so that every one of us can show up, do great work, be rewarded for the contribution that we're adding, and not excluded from the conversation or from moving forward, and not unintentionally benefited or privileged. And so when we think about fairness, the vast majority of humans have a very strong reaction to fairness from a very young age. You see it in children, you see it in animals. And so the more that we can anchor on fairness as a way to, unpack this conversation and move things forward, then that starts to become something that folks don't really disagree with all that much. But when it feels like it's about one group versus another, or a single pie that needs to be kind of divided up in different ways, then it does start to feel like a zero-sum game.
Yeah. It feels like the workplace is, maybe it's not the last place, but it feels like a place where we still have an opportunity or a mandate to work with all kinds of different people who have very different perspectives. And that's a good thing, but it's not always an easy thing to navigate as well.
Absolutely. And to your point, the fact that it's not easy is kind of inherently woven into the whole nature of this. And so if you put, 50 Khalils in an organization and said, hey, make a decision, we'd probably get there pretty quickly, because we'd say, you want to turn left also? Oh, so do I. That's brilliant. Oh, that's the smartest thing I could imagine anyone saying. Great. Let's go grab lunch. Where do you want to eat? That's where I want to eat too. Wonderful. Yeah. Right. That feels very fluid. And in some instances, it kind of makes us think that that's what teams should feel like. And yet, in the best scenarios, when you bring in diverse perspectives and different backgrounds and different information, there is a degree of dissonance, right? Of challenging one another, of pushing back against things. And that tension, that friction can feel like you're underperforming or you're not doing what you should be doing. And yet, in reality, if we thought about something like a gym as a metaphor, you would look at that and say, well, if you go to the gym and you work out for half an hour and you leave and you think, I could do that all day, you probably didn't burn a lot of fat or build a lot of muscle or really, get any better cardiovascularly. You want some of that tension. You want some of that grit. You want to be a bit tired and sweaty. And that's how you should feel at the end of a good work day. Mm-hmm. But similarly, if at the end of a gym session, you can't walk or you broke a bone or tore a muscle or something, that's not good either. And so there's this kind of, Goldilocks zone of tension and conflict and challenging around ideas and experiences that allows us to really kind of push for that. And as you say, I've often believed after most of us are done with kind of our, being raised by our parents or, educated in our school systems, work is a lot of where we learn what's okay and what's not, what's rewarded and what's penalized. Mm-hmm. And so when you're bringing together different people from different experiences and different cultures and different points of view, that can feel really challenging. And yet, if the company truly believes that there's a responsibility to kind of grow people, develop them, support them, and then send them back out to their lives to do things differently and to continue to kind of be good citizens, be good parents, do all of the things that they should be doing, And the company has this amazing space to say, listen, I know that you may not believe these things outside of work, but here we do believe that everyone can contribute. And we absolutely want everyone to have the opportunity to step up and do great work. And so when you see that happen, there's something called this kind of mere exposure effect, right? That you may not believe it right out of the gate, but if I had some bias against female leaders, but then all of a sudden over and over and over again, I work in an organization where I see incredibly talented female leaders, just the exposure to that is going to fundamentally change the way that I view things and will probably change the way that I view women outside of the workplace as well. It's not easy, it's not fast, but it is incredibly effective and it benefits the organization.
Yeah, so let's talk more about that because I think on one hand, we don't have to convince anybody that having a strong culture is important. And yet it feels like the and yet part is it feels like when we set our priorities, for what we need to accomplish or the things we really need to focus on, maybe that's not the top of the conversation that we're having. But I'm interested in some of the things that you've written about where you talk about culture being a performance imperative. And there's probably moments where the culture is helping, but there's sometimes where it's holding us back. Could you talk about that a little bit, Khalil?
Yeah. Ultimately, if we just take a step back and think about culture as how things get done around here. In a lot of ways, you've probably heard the kind of phrase that, the eyes are the window to the soul. I would argue that meetings are the window to an organization. And so if you dropped into a meeting inside of any particular company and you saw the dynamics around who speaks, how they speak, how decisions are made, how time is used, what's the level of follow-up, how do all those things go together, very quickly from an ethnographic perspective, right? If you were just observing and then you walked out of that meeting, you'd probably look and say, I don't know that they're actually going to follow through on that. Or did you see the way that Khalil zoned out when they were having that conversation? All of those things are the little kind of behaviors and nuances and different things that either benefit an organization. So are we aligned around our decision making? Do we include perspectives and disagree vehemently and then say, great, we've heard everyone. Now a decision has been made and we need to all go off and execute as if it was our decision from the very beginning? Or do you find kind of what you might hear in the business world, this idea of a pocket veto, right? Where we nod and smile in the meeting and then immediately go out and say, I'm not doing that. Or, just wait for the thing to fail. And so those are the examples of times where a culture is not benefiting the organization because the habits, the behaviors, the ways of operating are working against what you would ideally want. And then there are the organizations where you go in and there's a meeting with a clear agenda. Everybody knows what they're there to do. They haven't just invited people for the sake of being there. There's real clarity and kind of execution. Decisions are made after folks are leaving. There's, kind of visibility into who's going to take what on next. And so, again, not everything happens in meetings, but that's just a small example of the difference. And those differences are very slight. And to your point, it's probably why it doesn't always rise to the level of how are we going to focus on our culture? Because it can be very easy, not easy, just in general, but easy compared to focusing on culture to think about, the finance budget or the marketing budget or the thing that is right in front of you that everyone can agree to.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff in there. I think the one of my big takeaways as I was listening to you, Khalil, was I think I'm going to try to be an ethnographer in one of my upcoming meetings and just observe us, try and say, like, how are we behaving in our meetings? Like, what are the rituals? What are those behaviors? Like, does this seem like we're going to get things done and that we're asking everybody for different opinions and that we're accepting that, I think that might be an interesting exercise.
It is. And Chris, there's a reason that folks talk about this idea of the beginner's mindset, right? That can I go back to a place before I was kind of encumbered or burdened with all of this knowledge? And the ability to take a step back, view those things, really look at them through an unbiased lens and not judging is this good or bad, but just what are we doing, and is what we're doing going to get us closer to our intended objectives and to our intended outcomes, or is it moving us further away from those things? And so it's one of the first things I talk about in the book, kind of the A in this model, awareness. How do you get awareness around the challenges or the benefits of your organization, and do so by asking deep questions and looking at research and pulling in different perspectives. And in order to get to some degree of truth, you kind of have to admit that you don't already have everything all figured out, which is also not always a comfortable place to be.
I'm so glad you went there, because I did want to ask you about this model that you put forth in your book. I always love a good framework if it helps me remember things. So an ABCS framework. Can you just walk us through, like you talked about awareness, but maybe you can talk about the others too.
So they are linear at the very start, and then I find that organizations tend to kind of pop into the place that makes the most sense for them as they're continuing to iterate and go through the cycle. So the A, as I mentioned, is for awareness. It's kind of the how do you get oriented around the challenge, really understand the thing that you're trying to solve for as a part of the culture and what you're trying to understand. The B is for behaviors. And so that gets at very clearly, very specifically, what are the things that we want to see or hear done differently after we're kind of, through this cycle. And so it is different than something like be inclusive, right? That's very robust. It's very broad. It's difficult for folks to kind of determine, was I inclusive or not? Was he or she inclusive or not? Versus, we can talk a bit about what do better behaviors look like. The C is for community. I think in any change management space, in any organization, you can't move things unless you go from a small group to a larger group, right? You need to bring people along. So I can build all the awareness I want, kind of identify the behaviors, but if I don't expand that out to a larger group of people, it's going to stay pretty narrow and pretty focused only potentially on my own kind of ways of operating. And then the S is for systems. And so, everything that you want to bake into the fabric of your organization, you've got to put it into your systems. And the systems can be things like rewards and promotions and recognition. They can be performance management. They can be technology systems. But it's about how are the things that we have put in place reinforcing or undermining all of those other things we've said. So if we say we want to take 5 minutes at the end of every meeting to capture agenda notes and be clear about who comes next, because the thing that we've identified in the awareness stage is we're having these meetings and nobody knows what comes next. Okay, why? What's going on there? Great, we've identified the behavior, we spread it out to more people, but if our meetings are not set up in such a way, or we don't have a great place to capture those notes, or we don't have a mechanism for distributing them to people, then we may say that this thing matters, but we either constantly go all the way to the end of the meeting and we discard it, or we say that folks should capture it, but they're capturing it in a million different ways. So it really is the symmetry of all of these things and them fitting together that allows us to go from identifying a challenge to really weaving it into the way in which we operate.
Yeah. Well, and back to your kind of working out analogy earlier, like you don't ever really stop. It's not,
I wish that we could, Chris.
I know. And I feel that way whenever I have to do another rep, like doing the hard stuff. I'm like, no, I don't want to do one more of those. Let's stop.
Exactly. Yep. And working out, I think, is a great, metaphor in a lot of ways, because you have to get clear on what it is you're trying to accomplish, because the same exercise can, do very different things. And so if you just go to the gym and watch what someone else is doing, which is sometimes what businesses do, they look at the popular press, they look at what others are doing and say, let's deploy that performance management system, or let's, do this thing over here, or let's jump headfirst into that. But without really understanding, well, they're doing that because that fits in their ecosystem and what they're trying to accomplish. And so taking all of that all the way through to say, well, if what I'm trying to do is build this muscle, then I should do these particular types of activities, not just, run, but it's run how far, run how fast, not just squat, but squat with weights or without weights, how often, all of those things. And ideally, when you bring others together, you create a bit of a social fabric that allows you to do it more effectively. CrossFit is a great example of that, where people say, I continue to work out because of the community.
Yeah. So when you mention the word community, it is a trigger for me that I want to pick your brain a little bit about the physical expression, the physical environment which of course we think about a lot, and people who listen to the podcast are thinking about as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that we often say is like your physical place is like the body language of your culture. When somebody walks into the door and they see how you work and where you work, it is that manifestation of what your culture is all about. So I'm curious, and I know you're not an interior designer, but if you had advice for, those of us who are thinking about space and putting that together with culture, are there things that you'd say, you really try and think about this or try and do that?
Absolutely. And I think it's exactly what you've already been describing, which is to be really thoughtful and intentional about the physical space. And you use the term manifestation, which is exactly what came to mind, is a physical manifestation of what we're trying to accomplish. And so, I worked at Apple for a long time. We would always tell these stories of Steve Jobs. And there was the story of him helping to design the Pixar building, and being really clear about, we want this shared space where there's going to be this kind of serendipity where people just accidentally bump into one another, right? And so being thoughtful about, well, we want collaboration. How are we going to get that? Well, if we create some shared spaces that are drawing people in and people are bumping into one another, that's going to help create some of what we're looking for. Are you looking for isolation? Are you looking for creativity? I was at a conference a little while ago and folks were talking about, where the light is coming in and the plants and the seats and the music and the sound and the scent. All of these things are a part of, is my physical space optimizing the things that we've said are important as an organization? I think that the challenge that we don't always see is the marriage between the physical experience, the kind of mental experience, the emotional experience, the performance experience, and blending all of those together, because they do tend to live in very isolated parts of the business. The places that are doing that thoughtfully and saying, well, let's talk about what we believe our culture is, and what does that mean for our physical spaces, and what does that mean for the type of music we want to play, or the type of food we want to have available, or the type of seating that we want to have. All of those things then come together and you feel the intention, and that intention comes through in a number of ways, both that you can observe sometimes, but also just ways that help optimize how the organization gets work done.
So before I let you go, I want to ask you to look out into the future for us and share with us if you see any kind of big inflection points coming, or if there's something that's out on the horizon that you would say organizations really need to be thinking about this over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and I'm probably a little bit anchored on the conversation around AI right now, and I think that will continue to be. But more than that, I think the best organizations, the most thoughtful organizations, are going to get very clear on the relationship between technology and their people. And so I see some organizations that are swinging that pendulum in one direction and saying, let's ignore the technology. We're all about our people. We don't need to worry about that stuff. That's just all smoke and mirrors. It's no big deal. I see a lot of other technology companies in many instances that are swinging the pendulum in the other direction and saying, I don't know that we need younger coders or middle managers or any of those folks anymore. Now we're just going to go all in on AI because that's going to allow us to really be successful. I think even beyond AI and whatever that promise or peril may be, there's this conversation around what is the social contract between an employer and their employees. And 50 years ago in certain parts of the world, that was, you come here, give us your energy and your effort. You can retire here. We'll give you a gold watch and a pension. Everything's going to be wonderful. Now there's a bit more of a gig economy where it's, I don't believe in you. You don't believe in me. I'm here while I get a paycheck, and then you may let me go. I may decide to go take on something else. I think there will come a rebalancing where, again, some of the best organizations get a real reputation for being places that say, we want you to stay. We want you to grow. We want to develop you. And when the time is right for you to move on, if you're moving on to something, because I often say in my role, I'm at my best when people are leaving because they're running towards something, not running away from something. And so if they're running away from the organization or running away from a manager, that's a problem. But if they said, oh my gosh, I'm going to take everything I learned to go open my own business, or I feel like I'm ready for a promotion and I get my manager isn't going anywhere, and so I'm going to go off and take my skills to this other organization, that for me is a win, because they will still go back and say, oh, you're thinking about working at at this company. I loved it there. I learned so much. That's an incredible place. And so the companies that I think get that balance of extracting value from people and injecting value into their people, their teams, are going to be the ones that have a real performance differentiator.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we just can't, I don't see how we can continue to produce good work if we're just extracting from people all the time.
Absolutely. But you see it in a lot of instances where folks have said, hey, listen, it's kind of just the workforce. And so CEOs that are excited about their companies getting smaller, or folks that have said, this whole group of people can be replaced. And some of what you forget is that everyone is listening. And so it goes beyond that group. It's everyone else who is still in your organization that says, well, how long until I become that group? And so how is the organization going to treat me? Not in the best of times, but in the worst of times.
For sure.
And when you treat people well when times are tough, they tend to remember that and reward it.
I think that is a very important point. So let's end on that note, and our wishes that everybody who's listening carries that forward with them and thinks very intentionally about how do we treat people when we're going through tough times and good times. So
absolutely.
Thanks for being here with us today, Khalil. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to everyone who's listening.
75% of employees use AI at work. But is your workplace designed to support AI integration? Learn how AI is entering the workplace as an organizer, analyst, director, and coworker in a new Work Better magazine article. Discover more and get your free copy at steelcase.com/WB magazine.
From the habits in our meetings to the design of our workplaces, culture is really everywhere, and it matters a lot more than we think sometimes. Khalil really helped remind me to be mindful of how things get done around here and to make sure that I am respectfully challenging and listening to all ideas. Before you go, I want to ask you if you would be willing to share this episode with a friend or a colleague and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And please visit us at steelcase.com/research to sign up for the Work Better weekly newsletter for workplace research and design ideas delivered right to your inbox. Thanks again for being here, and we hope your day at work tomorrow is just a little bit better. Thank you to everyone who helps us work better, including our producers, Katie Pace, Rebecca Charbowski, Stav Kontas, Chiara Licari, and Brandon Lasik. We are thankful for the creative art direction by Aaron Ellison and Emily Cowdery, and for the editing and sound mixing by Soundpost Studios, and the technical support by Mark Caswell, Sean McManaman, and Jose Jimenez. Our digital publishing is by Areli Ariano and Jordan Marks.